Clint Eastwood walked into the courtroom, calm and steady, but before he could take his seat, Victor Lang sneered from across the room. "Go back to Hollywood, old man. You don't belong here." The entire courtroom went silent. Reporters turned their cameras. Lawyers smirked. But Clint? He just smiled, because he had a plan. What happened next shattered Lang's world, exposed a billion-dollar scandal, and proved that some men are never too old to deliver justice. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, and every conversation in the packed hall came to an abrupt halt. Clint Eastwood stepped inside, his signature slow, deliberate gait making each step feel like the ticking of a clock. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone commanded attention. Reporters whispered, cameras clicked, and a few murmurs rippled through the gallery. But across the room, seated at the defendant's table, billionaire Victor Lang was anything but intimidated. Lang, dressed in an expensive three-piece suit, exuded the smug confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he watched Clint take his seat. His fingers drummed lazily against the polished oak of the defense table, as if this entire trial was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "You're wasting your time, Eastwood," Lang drawled, his voice dripping with amusement. "You can't touch me." Clint didn't flinch. He removed his sunglasses with practiced ease, tucking them into his jacket pocket before leveling a slow, calculating gaze at Lang. His icy blue eyes locked onto the billionaire like a predator sizing up its prey. The room held its breath. The case had gripped the entire city. Lang was no ordinary businessman. He was a titan of real estate, the man behind towering skyscrapers and luxury developments. But behind the gleaming facades of his buildings lay a trail of corruption, stolen land, displaced families, fraudulent investments, and a network of officials he had bribed into silence. He had crushed anyone who stood in his way, using his wealth and influence as both a shield and a weapon. And now he was sitting comfortably, convinced this courtroom was just another boardroom where he could manipulate the outcome. His high-powered lawyers, seated beside him, shared his confidence. They chuckled, exchanging knowing glances. Everyone in the room knew the truth. Lang had the judge in his pocket. The system was rigged, and no matter what evidence was presented today, the outcome had already been decided. Lang leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go back to making movies, old man." The insult hung in the air, waiting for a reaction. But Clint didn't take the bait. Instead, he remained impossibly still, like a storm on the horizon, silent but inevitable. Slowly he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the plaintiff's table, his fingers laced together, and then, in that signature, gravelly voice, he finally spoke. "Son," Clint said, his voice low and steady, "I don't waste my time." Lang's smirk widened. Clint's eyes narrowed. "But you," Clint continued, his words cutting through the silence like a blade, "you just ran out of yours." For the first time that day, Lang's confidence flickered. Just for a second. And in that moment, Clint knew exactly how this was going to end. The judge cleared his throat, banging his gavel. "Let's begin," he said, but Clint barely heard him. He was already watching Lang, watching as the cracks began to show. Victor Lang leaned back in his chair, exuding the smug confidence of a man who had already won. His high-powered legal team sat beside him, their suits crisp, their smirks even sharper. They had done this 100 times before, twisting the law, bending the system, buying the right people. And today would be no different. Judge Morrison, a man who had built his career by ruling in favor of the highest bidder, barely looked up from his papers. His disinterest was deliberate, his role in this charade already set. He sighed, rubbing his temple, as if the entire case was a minor inconvenience. Lang's lead attorney, a sleek, sharp-featured man named Ethan Crane, stood up and straightened his tie. "Your Honor, this entire case is a waste of the court's time," he declared smoothly. "There is no substantial evidence against my client. The accusations are baseless, built on speculation and conspiracy theories." He shot a glance at Clint Eastwood, his smirk widening. "At best, it's the plot of an old Western." A few quiet chuckles echoed from the defense side of the room. Lang himself let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Judge Morrison barely nodded. You're requesting a dismissal? Crane nodded confidently. That is correct, Your Honor. Let our honor not waste any more of the court's valuable time. The judge exhaled through his nose and leaned back in his chair. I'm inclined to agree. There doesn't seem to be. A soft tap, tap, tap filled the silent courtroom. Clint sat motionless, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden table in front of him. He had seen this game before, played by men just like Lang, men who thought the law was just another tool to be bought and sold. He waited a beat, then another. Then he raised a single finger. The movement was slow, deliberate. The judge hesitated, narrowing his eyes. Mr. Eastwood? Lang's smirk faltered for the briefest second. Clint leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. His voice was steady, unshaken. Hold it! Judge Morrison arched a brow, clearly irritated. Excuse me? Clint smirked, finally meeting the judge's gaze head-on. You heard me. The tension in the room shifted. The courtroom, once filled with casual arrogance, suddenly felt heavier. The reporters leaned in. The spectators stopped whispering. Even Lang's lawyers glanced at each other, sensing something was about to change. Judge Morrison sighed, rubbing his forehead. Mr. Eastwood, unless you have something of actual relevance? Clint cut him off. Oh, you bet I do. The air in the courtroom thickened. Lang shifted in his seat, his smirk now gone. For the first time, the untouchable billionaire looked uneasy. The air in the courtroom grew heavy, a silence stretching between Clint Eastwood and Victor Lang. The billionaire tycoon, who moments ago had been lounging with unchecked arrogance, suddenly sat up straighter. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished oak of the defense table, but the forced smirk remained. Judge Morrison, still leaning back in his chair, exhaled through his nose as if bored. Mr. Eastwood, I hope you're not wasting this court's time. Clint remained still, his weathered hands resting on the table in front of him. He didn't rush. He never did. Instead, he reached into his jacket, retrieving a neatly folded stack of papers. Without a word, he slid them across the table toward the prosecutor. Lang's lawyer, Ethan Crane, scoffed, shaking his head. More theatrics, Mr. Eastwood? What is this? A script for your next film? Clint's expression didn't change. Emails, he said simply. From Lang's own company. That wiped the smirk off Crane's face. Lang's fingers clenched against the desk. His lawyer, catching the change in his client's posture, leaned forward. Your Honor, this is highly unorthodox. Any so-called emails obtained outside the proper legal channels are... The prosecutor cleared his throat, flipping through the stack of documents Clint had provided. Then he turned to the judge, holding up a page. Your Honor, these are internal communications between Victor Lang and several executives from his real estate firm. They explicitly discuss fraudulent transactions, land grabs, forged signatures, evictions based on falsified claims. The courtroom broke into hushed murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Lang's jaw tightened. His foot tapped rapidly beneath the desk. He had been in tight spots before. But this was something else. Judge Morrison, however, remained composed. Too composed. His expression barely changed as he slowly leaned forward. And how exactly were these emails obtained? Clint tilted his head slightly, like a gunslinger gauging an opponent. Wouldn't you like to know? Lang's lawyer seized the opportunity, standing abruptly. Your Honor, this is a violation of evidentiary protocol. There's no proof these documents were obtained legally. We move to have them thrown out. The judge turned to the prosecutor, then back at Clint. His fingers drummed the desk once, twice. I'm inclined to agree. The courtroom erupted into gasps. Lang exhaled slowly, regaining his composure, his smirk slowly returning. Judge Morrison nodded, banging his gavel. The emails are inadmissible. The court will not consider them as evidence. The murmurs turned into full-blown outrage. Clint? He just chuckled. A deep, knowing chuckle that made Lang's smirk falter once more. Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice, steady as ever, cut through the chaos. You just made the worst mistake of your career, Judge. Judge Morrison stiffened, suddenly realizing Clint wasn't done yet. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the tension thick as Judge Morrison's gavel slammed down, demanding silence. But even as the noise faded, the energy in the room remained charged. Clint Eastwood sat still, his fingers interlaced on the table, watching the judge with an expression that was impossible to read. Across the room, Victor Lang shifted in his chair, attempting to mask the unease creeping into his sharp features. For a moment, it seemed like Lang had won. The judge had just ruled Clint's evidence inadmissible, and the billionaire had started to settle back into his usual arrogance. But then, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head turned toward the sound. A woman stood in the middle of the audience, her hands gripping the back of the bench in front of her. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Though her voice trembled slightly, the determination in her eyes was unmistakable. "Your Honor," she said, lifting a small black flash drive into the air, "I have something the court needs to see." Victor Lang's entire body went rigid. Judge Morrison frowned, peering over his glasses. "And you are?" She swallowed, then squared her shoulders. "Sandra Myers. I was the lead accountant for Lang Industries, until I was fired for asking too many questions." Lang's lawyer shot to his feet instantly. "Objection! This woman is not a verified witness, nor has she been called to testify." The prosecutor, sensing something big, stood as well. "Your Honor, if she has evidence relevant to this case, the court should hear it." Judge Morrison hesitated, looking between the attorneys and Sandra. He opened his mouth, likely to shut it all down, but before he could speak, Clint leaned forward. "Let the lady talk." There was something in his tone, something that made even the judge pause. Morrison's lips pressed into a thin line, and after a long silence, he finally gestured toward the bailiff. "Bring the drive forward." Sandra exhaled, gripping the flash drive tightly as she walked down the aisle. When she handed it over, the bailiff immediately inserted it into the courtroom's large display screen. A file appeared. "Show it," the prosecutor said. The screen flickered, and suddenly a series of spreadsheets filled the room. Rows and columns of numbers, transactions, property deals. But what stood out were the notes attached to them. Fraudulent purchases, shell companies, bribes labeled as consulting fees. This wasn't just evidence. This was the smoking gun. Lang's face lost all color. His lawyer frantically flipped through his notes, as if there was anything in that binder that could save them now. The prosecutor pointed at the screen. "These are the real financial records of Lang Industries, aren't they?" Sandra nodded. "Yes, these are the books Lang didn't want anyone to see. The ones that show exactly how he's been scamming people for years." The entire courtroom gasped. Judge Morrison's face darkened, his fingers gripping the edge of his bench. Lang, barely keeping his composure, leaned over to his lawyer, his voice a sharp whisper. "We need to shut this down. Now." The lawyer's eyes flicked toward the judge, who, despite his forced neutrality, looked equally unsettled. Whatever Lang was planning, it wasn't going to be pretty. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The evidence on the screen was damning, leaving no room for doubt. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Cameras clicked, and even the jurors exchanged glances. Victor Lang sat motionless, his once confident smirk wiped clean off his face. But then, as if remembering who he was, he straightened his tie and turned to the judge, a silent understanding passing between them. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. His expression hardened as he banged his gavel, demanding order. "This court will not be turned into a media circus," he said, his voice steady but laced with something else. "Control. Given the unexpected nature of this so-called evidence, I am ruling that this trial is compromised and must be postponed until further review." The entire room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, outrage. The prosecutor shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the evidence is clear." "The integrity of this trial is at stake," Morrison interrupted, his voice rising. "We cannot allow procedural misconduct to dictate the outcome of a case of this magnitude." Sandra, the whistleblower, looked horrified. "But that's enough," Morrison snapped, slamming the gavel again. "This case is over for today. Court is adjourned." Clint hadn't moved an inch. While the prosecutor argued, while Sandra looked on in disbelief, while Lang's lawyers exchanged relieved smirks, Clint just sat there, calm, watching, as if he had already known this was coming. Victor Lang let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders back like a man who had just been given a second life. He pushed his chair back and stood, smoothing out the lapels of his designer suit. He strolled over to Clint, his grin returning, confidence oozing back into his voice. "Nice try, cowboy," he drawled, extending a hand. "But this is the real world, and in the real world, money talks." Clint glanced at Lang's outstretched hand, but didn't take it. Instead, he stood up, towering over the billionaire, and dusted off his jacket. His movements were slow, deliberate. Lang chuckled. Nothing to say? That's what I thought. Then just as Lang turned to walk away, Clint spoke. His voice. Then just as Lang turned to walk away, Clint spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the tense silence like a loaded gun being cocked. You think you got away? Lang paused. Clint tilted his head slightly. Look behind you. Lang's smirk wavered as he turned, and his face paled. Something, or someone, was waiting. And suddenly, it didn't feel like he'd won at all. Victor Lang's confident smirk shattered the moment he turned around. Standing at the entrance of the courtroom were two men in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. The air in the room shifted as they stepped forward, flashing their badges with the weight of finality. Victor Lang, the taller agent announced, his voice cutting through the courtroom's stunned silence. We need you to come with us. Lang's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His eyes darted between the agents and his high-priced legal team. His lead attorney, an older man with graying hair and an expensive three-piece suit, immediately stepped in. This is outrageous, the lawyer scoffed. My client is in the middle of a trial. You have no jurisdiction here. The second agent, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of unshakable authority, cut him off. We're federal agents, counselor. We have jurisdiction anywhere we need it. She pulled a folded document from her jacket and handed it to the judge, who hesitated before accepting it. This is a federal warrant for Mr. Lang's arrest. We've been investigating him for months. Lang's face twisted in fury. This is a joke, he spat. Some kind of publicity stunt. The male agent ignored him, instead glancing at Clint, who had remained seated, arms crossed, watching everything unfold with a quiet amusement. We received an interesting tip a few weeks ago, the agent continued, shifting his gaze back to Lang. Turns out, when someone digs deep enough, they find everything. Lang's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His fingers curled into fists. He whirled on Clint, voice low and seething. You set me up. Clint leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed. Son, you set yourself up. The billionaire took a step toward him, but before he could say another word, the female agent positioned herself between them. Mr. Lang, she said firmly, if you resist, we can add obstruction of justice to the list of charges. I suggest you don't. Lang's lawyer, now sweating, tried once more to salvage the situation. At least allow my client to make a statement before you parade him out of here like a common criminal. The agent scoffed. Your client is a criminal. Lang turned toward Judge Morrison, expecting an ally. But the judge, now visibly shaken, simply looked down, avoiding his gaze. Lang had bribed a lot of people, but even Morrison knew when a sinking ship couldn't be saved. Lang inhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling as he desperately sought a way out. This isn't over, he hissed under his breath. Clint, standing now, adjusted his jacket. Yeah, well, he muttered, his voice steady as ever. That's what they all say. The tension in the room thickened as the male agent reached for his cuffs. Victor Lang, he repeated, stepping closer. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Lang's lawyer stepped forward, still clinging to hope. This is ridiculous. There must be something we can do. One of the agents barely spared him a glance before shaking his head. Not a chance. The walls of Judge Morrison's courtroom had always felt impenetrable. For years he had ruled with unchecked authority, securing favors for the powerful and ensuring justice bent in favor of those who could afford it. But tonight, the very foundation he had built his career on was crumbling beneath him. As Victor Lang was led out in handcuffs, the murmurs in the courtroom grew into a dull roar. Reporters whispered frantically, their pens scratching against their notepads, capturing history as it unfolded. The corporate lawyers who once sat confidently beside Lang now looked pale, realizing their biggest ally was no longer untouchable. Across the room, Clint Eastwood remained where he was, hands resting on the table, his face unreadable. He had seen enough men like Morrison to know that when one king falls, his entire court tumbles with him. A voice cut through the noise. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, standing tall, her tone sharp with authority. Given the shocking developments in this case, the state formally moves to have you removed from the bench. Judge Morrison flinched, but his mask of control barely wavered. He glanced at the prosecutor, his grip tightening around the gavel. On what grounds? He asked, voice tight. The prosecutor didn't hesitate. On the grounds that your impartiality is in question, Your Honor. She turned toward the gallery. where an investigator holding a thick folder stepped forward. Newly uncovered financial records suggest a pattern of... Morrison's gavel came down with force. "This is my courtroom," he snapped. "You don't get to come in here with baseless accusations." The investigator remained unfazed. "Your Honor, the evidence is neither baseless nor an accusation. We have multiple transactions linked to offshore accounts, bribes tied directly to Victor Lang's legal team." A heavy silence settled over the room. Morrison's face twitched. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, tracing a slow path down his cheek. The prosecutor pressed forward. "We have reason to believe you've been protecting Lang for years, dismissing cases, bearing evidence, and ensuring verdicts always fell in his favor." She motioned to the bailiff, who hesitated before stepping toward the judge's bench. Morrison's fingers gripped the arms of his chair. "This is a disgrace," he muttered. "I have served this court with honor." Clint let out a low chuckle, finally breaking his silence. "Honor?" He leaned back, shaking his head. "You sold your honor for a paycheck, Judge." Morrison's head snapped toward him, his face darkening. "You," he hissed. "You had no business being here today." Clint met his gaze unshaken. "And yet, here I am." The prosecutor turned back to Morrison, her voice final. "Effective immediately, this court is placing you under investigation. You will step down from this case." The judge's breath quickened. The power he had wielded for so long was slipping from his grasp, and he knew it. His lips parted, his voice coming out unsteady. "I can explain." The prosecutor raised a hand, cutting him off. "Save it for your own trial, Your Honor." But Morrison knew the truth. No one was listening anymore. Victor Lang had spent a lifetime bending the law to his will, turning obstacles into stepping stones, and buying his way out of trouble. But today, for the first time, he felt the weight of a system he couldn't control closing in around him. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. The FBI agents stood firm, their expressions unreadable as they flanked him. His high-powered attorney had already taken a step back, suddenly unsure if he wanted to be associated with Lang's sinking ship. The judge, his judge, was gone, his safety net ripped away in front of the world. Lang exhaled slowly, pressing his palms flat against the table. He had one last move, and if history had taught him anything, it was that money always spoke louder than morals. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough so that only the two FBI agents could hear. "Listen, gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. "I get it. You're just doing your jobs, and I respect that." The lead agent, a sharp-eyed man named Agent Carter, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Lang continued, his confidence returning. "But let's be honest. What's happening here? A fraud case? A white-collar scandal? This isn't some cartel bust. It's just business." He let the words settle before delivering his offer. $10 million, cash. You walk away and we all forget this ever happened. A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Lang's own lawyer turned, horrified. Agent Carter exchanged a glance with his partner, then looked back at Lang, amused. "You serious?" Lang nodded, smirking. "Completely. 10 million now, and another 10 once this all blows over." For a brief second, Lang thought he saw hesitation. Then Carter let out a low chuckle, the kind that sent chills down a man's spine. "We're already looking, Mr. Lang," Carter said, leaning down slightly, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "At your prison sentence." Lang's smirk faded. Carter straightened, nodding to his partner. "You just added attempted bribery of a federal agent to your charges. Congratulations." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room as realization hit Lang like a freight train. His fingers twitched against the table, his mind racing for an escape. But there was none. No friendly judge, no political favor, no legal loophole. Just the walls closing in, the weight of his crimes finally catching up to him. He slumped back into his chair, his body suddenly feeling heavier than it had in years. The reality of his downfall set in. For the first time in his life, Victor Lang had no more moves left to play. Victor Lang had built an empire on control. He controlled the land, the people, the judges, and even the law itself, until today. Now as he sat in the defendant's chair, his control was slipping through his fingers like sand in an hourglass. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The federal judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his face unreadable as he glanced over the stack of documents before him. The crowd of reporters and spectators leaned in, waiting for the moment that would decide the fate of one of the most powerful real estate moguls in the country. Lang's fingers drummed against the table, but this time, there was no arrogance in his posture, only a desperate, nervous energy. His lawyer, pale and visibly shaken, whispered something in his ear, but Lang barely heard him. His mind was racing, trying to find an angle, a loophole, anything that could turn this around. The judge took a deep breath and spoke, his voice echoing across the silent room. After reviewing the evidence presented in this case, he paused, his sharp eyes locking onto Lang. Including financial records, fraudulent contracts, and multiple witness testimonies, this court finds Victor Lang guilty of real estate fraud, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, and attempted bribery of federal agents. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few scattered claps. The weight of the words settled on Lang's shoulders like a death sentence. His jaw tightened, but his face remained frozen. The judge wasn't done. Effective immediately, all assets connected to Mr. Lang's fraudulent dealings will be frozen, pending further investigation. Furthermore, due to the severity of these crimes, bail is denied. Lang shot up from his chair. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. I have rights." His voice was laced with desperation, the last flicker of a man grasping at straws. The judge didn't flinch. "You also have consequences." Two federal marshals stepped forward, their movements slow, deliberate. Lang's chest heaved. He turned wildly, scanning the room for someone, anyone, to intervene. But his high-powered friends, the same politicians and investors who once showered him with praise, were either looking away or pretending they didn't know him. Clint Eastwood stood near the exit, watching the scene unfold with the calm patience of a man who had seen this story play out before. His sharp eyes met Lang's, and for the first time there was no smugness left in the tycoon's expression, just fear. Clint adjusted his coat, his voice smooth as ever. "Should have played it straight, Lang." Reporters rushed toward Clint, microphones raised, questions flying. "Mr. Eastwood, how did you know this would happen?" Clint smirked, tilting his hat. "Didn't, just had a hunch." Victor Lang had built his empire by knowing the right people, greasing the right palms, and staying 2 steps ahead of the law. No deal, no contract, no ruling had ever gone against him, until now. But he wasn't done yet. As the courtroom buzzed with the weight of his conviction, Lang sat rigid in his chair, his fingers gripping the edges of the defense table. His lawyer, a younger, nervous-looking man, replacing the one who had bailed on him after the guilty verdict, wiped sweat from his brow, fumbling through papers as he stood to address the court. "Your Honor, given the extensive media coverage surrounding this trial, we argue that the jury's decision was tainted by public influence. We respectfully demand a retrial on the grounds of media bias." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters exchanged glances, pens scratching against notepads. The judge, an older man with a face carved from a stone, remained motionless for a long moment before adjusting his glasses. His gaze locked onto Lang, scrutinizing him like a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Lang," the judge finally spoke, his voice measured, deliberate, inescapable. "You have spent decades bending the law to your will. Now that justice has caught up with you, you expect us to believe you didn't get a fair trial?" Lang leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "I built this city," he hissed. "Half the men in this room wouldn't have their careers without me." His lawyer stiffened beside him, clearly regretting taking this case. The judge didn't even blink. "And yet none of them are here to defend you." A sharp breath escaped Lang's nostrils. He wasn't used to losing. His brain scrambled for options, for an escape route, for anything that could still give him control. He turned toward Clint Eastwood, his eyes narrowing. "You think you won?" Lang sneered. "I still have friends in high places. Powerful ones." Clint, who had been watching in calm silence, finally cracked a smirk. He adjusted his coat, glancing toward the back of the room. "Yeah?" he said, his voice steady. "Well, so do I." At that moment, the heavy wooden courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak. The entire room turned to look. A figure stepped in, walking with purpose, heels clicking against the marble floor. Lang's face drained of color. The surprised witness strode toward the front of the courtroom. The judge turned his head, eyes widening in recognition. Lang's lawyer paled. And Lang? For the first time in his life, he looked afraid. Victor Lang had spent his entire life controlling the narrative. But in that moment, as the courtroom doors swung open, The story was no longer his to tell. His smirk vanished, his posture stiffened, and for the first time in years, fear crept into his eyes. The man who had just walked in, dressed in a sharp gray suit, his expression unreadable, was the last person Lang ever expected to see again. Daniel Carter, Lang's former right-hand man, his most trusted confidant, and the one person who knew every dirty secret buried beneath Lang's empire. The tension in the courtroom became suffocating. Reporters whispered among themselves, cameras flashing. Lang's lawyer shot to his feet, eyes darting between Carter and Lang, as if silently begging for instructions. But Lang had none. He was frozen in place, watching his past come to destroy him. Carter walked with a steady, deliberate pace, stopping in front of the judge. He didn't look at Lang. Not yet. Instead, he placed a thick folder onto the prosecution's table. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "inside this folder, you'll find detailed bank records, wire transfers, and offshore accounts all connected to Mr. Lang's fraudulent dealings. These documents will confirm every charge brought against him today." A gasp rippled through the room. Lang finally found his voice. "You lying son of a—" The judge silenced him with a sharp bang of his gavel. "Enough," he turned to the prosecution. "Is this evidence authenticated?" The lead prosecutor flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. "Yes, Your Honor. This is more than enough." Lang shot up from his seat, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "I demand this be thrown out. This man is a known liar." Carter finally turned to face him, a cold, amused smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Funny," he said. "That's what you used to say about all the people you ruined." Lang's breathing grew uneven, his hands clenched into fists. He turned to the judge, desperate now. "Your Honor, The judge cut him off with a glare. "Mr. Lang, sit down." His voice carried the weight of finality. Lang didn't move, chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. The judge continued, his tone unwavering. "Victor Lang, based on overwhelming evidence, this court finds you guilty on all counts. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, cheers, reporters scrambling to capture every second. Lang stumbled back into his chair, his world spinning out of control. The bailiffs moved toward him, cuffs in hand. His lawyer stepped away, already defeated. As the cold metal locked around his wrists, Lang's eyes darted to the back of the room. Clint Eastwood stood there, arms crossed, watching the whole thing unfold. Lang clenched his jaw. "This was you," he hissed. Clint tilted his head, his signature smirk returning. "Guess you ain't as untouchable as you thought." The bailiffs hauled Lang to his feet. As he was led toward the exit, cameras flashing, Clint tipped his hat. Justice had been served, but his work wasn't over yet. Victor Lang sat in the dimly lit prison rec room, his fingers twitching against the cold steel of the table. The flickering television in the corner of the room cast a dull blue glow over the chipped walls, its speakers humming with the latest breaking news. Victor Lang, once a billionaire real estate mogul, now faces a lengthy prison sentence after being exposed for years of corruption, bribery, and fraud. Thanks to Clint Eastwood's relentless pursuit of justice, Lang's empire has collapsed overnight. His assets seized, his allies scattered, his fortune reduced to dust. Lang's jaw tightened as the screen cut to footage outside the courthouse. There was Clint stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his face. A crowd had gathered, victims of Lang's schemes, reporters scrambling for a statement, people cheering as if they had just witnessed the fall of a dictator. A young reporter weaved through the crowd, microphone in hand. "Mr. Eastwood, how does it feel to take down one of the most powerful men in real estate?" Clint stopped, adjusting his hat with a small, knowing smirk. He glanced at the sea of cameras, then back at the reporter. "I didn't take him down," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. "He did that himself." The crowd erupted in applause. Clint tipped his hat to them before walking away, disappearing into the city streets as effortlessly as he had arrived. Back in the rec room, Lang's hands balled into fists. He could feel the stares of the other inmates, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. The guards didn't even bother to look his way anymore. He was just another criminal now, stripped of his status, his power, his influence. The screen flashed again, an aerial shot of his once magnificent mansion, now surrounded by federal agents seizing every last piece of his fortune. A sharp laugh cut through the silence. Lang turned his head to see an older inmate leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the news with amusement. Man, the inmate chuckled, shaking his head. Ain't that something? Big shot like you, brought down by some cowboy. Lang's face burned. He pushed away from the table, storming toward the nearest exit, but there was nowhere to go. As he reached the doorway, he caught a glimpse of himself in the small, cracked mirror mounted on the wall. Gone was the billionaire in tailored suits. In his place stood a man in a gray jumpsuit, a number stitched where his name used to be. He let out a slow breath, pressing his palms against the wall. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Meanwhile, miles away, Clint Eastwood stepped into his car, his work done. As he drove off into the sunset, the world kept talking about him, about what he had done. But Clint, he was already on to his next fight. Lang slumped against the cold wall of his cell, burying his face in his hands. His reign was over. And Clint, he was still untouchable.